Okay, we are here at Harvard University at the Kennedy School of Government, joined by veteran Ambassador Nicholas Burns, who is a professor of the practice of diplomacy here. And we're going to take a few minutes to ask some questions about diplomacy and its future. Let's first, Ambassador Burns, let's talk about Wikileaks, because interestingly enough, this wave of turbulence and unrest in the Middle East was partially sparked by a Wikileaks cable. On the one hand, the American diplomatic community has been up in arms and very much on the defensive about WikiLeaks. On the other hand, it's done quite a bit potentially to spur American foreign policy goals, such as potentially democratizing the region. So how do you see WikiLeaks now, now that it's had such potentially positive unintended consequences?
You know, I still think that the WikiLeaks phenomenon, the 250,000 cables leaked to Julian Assange, is very destructive of the United States' global position and of our ability to function as a government in the diplomatic environment. I'm quite willing to accommodate myself to the view, and you've written about this in your new book, that there's a new diplomacy, a new arena being created, and I think it's positive for us, and I think that it plays to our strengths. The fact that NGOs and citizens can be diplomats, and we've seen the rise of the NGOs over the last 30 years, almost solely positive. You know, with organizations like the Gates Foundation in our country, playing such a positive role on HIV/AIDS treatment and prevention. So I'm very much for this new citizen participation, but you also need to have a system of diplomacy that still is state to state, that does rely on the establishment of trust among leaders and governments, and the confidentiality of discussions. And what I found as a former diplomat most destructive about what Julian Assange did and about the impact of WikiLeaks is that it did impair trust, very important sets of relationships that we have with governments all around the world. So, you know, there may be some consequential benefits to the leak of some of these cables that you could point to, but I would say as a former diplomat, this is not something that's in our interest. And I guess I'd say this, you know, obviously the U.S. government needs to work on making sure that its confidential systems stay confidential, that we have control of our own material and they're not leaked out by our own employees. I also think that citizens, and I'm now a private citizen, need to accommodate themselves to the fact that that while we should seek as much transparency about government as possible, and the greater the transparency is better. And for instance, I support President Obama in shortening the time to declassify documents, official documents. I think that's positive. But there still has to be an element of diplomacy, the older, antique diplomacy that you've also written about, that relies on confidentiality. Because essentially, in a crisis like Egypt, for instance, President Obama's effectiveness was twofold. He was able to communicate, I think, pretty effectively publicly that we are supporting these young people in the street, their right to demonstrate peacefully. But he was also using our influence behind the scenes with President Mubarak in confidential conversations that should not have been and could not have been splashed in the front pages of the New York Times. So there has to be an element in diplomacy of confidentiality, of secrecy, and I think we ought to try to protect that.
So these terms, confidentiality, secrecy, building trust, and so forth, how do those, going forward, what role are they going to play in diplomacy, especially since now you're running a Future of Diplomacy project? Is that a pillar of that project, and can you tell us more about the broader project?
Thanks. Yeah, you know, I came to the Kennedy School 2.5 years ago, and what I immediately noticed was, this is the Kennedy School for Security Studies and the Kennedy School for War. We have tremendous capacity here, and it's really one of the great strengths of the school to understand the military, to understand security studies. Here in the Belfer Center where I worked, it may be the premier center in the United States for nuclear nonproliferation. But I thought that, given my own background, is that a country can't just rely on its martial strengths. A country has to rely on its wits, its ability to negotiate, to listen, to compromise, to understand, to get its way through soft power, if you will, diplomacy. And so I thought that was perhaps something that we should emphasize more. The leadership, Graham Allison, David Elwood here at the school has been very, very supportive of this, for which I'm grateful. And I just want our students here to have an opportunity to understand that I think increasingly in this highly integrated, globalized 21st century, even the superpower, the United States, will have to rely more on diplomacy, negotiations, multilateral diplomacy than we have in the past. I mean, I think, you know, you and I have both focused on these issues. What are the great challenges now? Almost all of them are transnational. climate change, trafficking of women and children, drug and crime cartels, nuclear proliferation, pandemics, you name them. We can name 30 of them. None of them lend themselves, none of those lend themselves solely to the use of military force. They all are going to require a much more sophisticated and cohesive American diplomacy to confront them. And that means working with others, not working unilaterally, not being isolated, but working with others. And so I have a pretty, like you, I have a big tent picture of what diplomacy is. And I think that this school needs to be at the forefront of understanding what that is, write about it, think about it, have our students think about it. So your presence here today and your book, I think it adds a lot to our understanding of what modern diplomacy is.
Now, you've also just said that America is a superpower and America has global interests. Something that worries me is these often futile debates that we have in Washington and elsewhere about prioritization. Should our eye be on China or should it be on the Middle East? And while we were in Iraq, we took our eye off of China. This notion that we have to prioritize. But isn't a superpower that entity that has global interests and is managing affairs and relationships in all parts of the world simultaneously? Is it a poor reflection on our bureaucracies that we aren't able to manage these issues simultaneously, and therefore we talk about the need to prioritize without, in any case, coming up with a real resolution?
Well, I guess I maybe question the conventional wisdom here, and maybe just answer your question that way. I think that, with some notable mistakes and notable lapses in judgment over the last 30 or 40 years, most of our American administrations, Republican and Democrat, have succeeded in executing a global foreign policy. And you're right. I mean, a global power like the U.S. or a global power like China cannot afford to have a foreign policy based on one or two regions of the world. We have to play on every field of the world. We have to be active in the Western Hemisphere. It's our home. We have to be active in Africa. For a long time, we were Eurocentric. That's gone with the end of the Cold War. And there's no question in my mind that while we are globally oriented, we should be present in each country. That was President Kennedy's ideal, that we should have an embassy in each country. I agree with that. And we should focus globally. I think there are two parts of the world right now that are posing the most vital challenges to us, the Middle East and East Asia. And so I think you'll see American diplomacy moving forward in the next 50 or 60 years, more focused on those two regions, in a way that we were focused on Europe for the 20th century, maybe the first decade of this century. But hopefully a foreign policy that is global in nature, that is active in every part of the world, and can we walk and chew gum at the same time? Yes. And I guess I don't buy the criticism that because we've been in Iraq for the last 7, 8 years, that we somehow haven't been focused on other parts of the world. We have. But I would say those two regions pose the greatest challenges, so we have to have a keen attention or a keen focus on those two.
Now, Ambassador, you have a lot of fans both in and out of the Foreign Service, and you're running a project on the future of diplomacy, which begs the question, when are we going to see you return to practice the future of diplomacy as a diplomat again?
I practiced diplomacy for 27 years, 3 months, and 9 days. That's the amount of time I was in the federal government, and I wouldn't trade any of those days for anything. It was a great experience. I'm very happy teaching, and I'm writing a book on the future of American diplomacy, and I think I'll do that first. Would I go back to government at some point in the future? Sure, if the opportunity arises, and if it's the right opportunity, if it fits my own family's needs. And right now, we're happy to be in the Athens of America, Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Well, Ambassador Burns, veteran ambassador and diplomat, and now professor at the Kennedy School. We eagerly anticipate your new book, and thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Brock. Thanks very much.